When we create our sketch-based geometry in Revit, we need to create that sketch on a plane. If we don't establish a plane to do that ahead of time, then Revit assumes one, and it usually uses one of the defaults, either the level of the project or one of the intersecting reference planes at the center of our family here. What we can do is establish an alternate work plane elsewhere in 3D space, and then we can create our sketch-based geometry on that work plane. The workflow can be to either establish the work plane first and then draw the geometry, or in the case where we have here, where we've already drawn the geometry, it's actually possible for us to establish the work plane after the fact and then move the geometry to that work plane. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at that process here in this file that we have on screen. So where we left off in the previous movie, we had identified that the slab was sitting on the floor, and we had set up these height reference planes to get us started establishing the height of the table. I would like to point out a slight difference in the reference planes that were already here in the template and the ones that we drew. So if you recall from the start of the exercise or any of the family templates that you may have previously been in, when you select them, there's a couple key settings that we looked at early in this chapter. One of those settings was the push pin. One of those settings was that it defines origin. But we also pointed out that there was a name or a label on that reference plane. It turns out that the key to using a reference plane as a work plane is the named label. In other words, if we look at the reference planes that we drew previously here in this exercise, you'll see that none of them highlight with a label. As such, if I tried to select this geometry and use this button here and choose Edit Work Plane, what we would see is that there are no choices other than the existing reference level, which it turns out, if you look at my 3D view there in the background, is the current work plane of this solid geometry. And it's the only choice. If I would rather have the work plane be associated with either this or this reference plane, what I need to do first is simply name those reference planes. As soon as I name that reference plane, it will become eligible to be a work plane, not only for the existing geometry that I've already drawn, but for any future geometry that I would like to draw there. If I simply select this reference plane, come over here to the Properties palette, I'll notice that there's a name parameter and it's currently empty. I can type anything I want in here. The name is not important, just that it has one. I like to use descriptive names. So I'm going to call this underside. Press enter to accept that and apply it. And you're going to see the label underside appear on that reference plane now in views where it's selected. Once I do that, I can return to selecting the geometry, click on the Edit Work Plane button, and when I open this list, I'll now have that additional choice there. I can choose that, and the geometry will jump up to that new height. So that solves half of our problem. We still have a slab that's too thick, but you can see the effect of the work plane. So by changing the work plane, the plane upon which this extrusion is sketched has now moved up to that new location. And I'm saying it that way because if I click Edit Extrusion, what you're going to see here is that if I switch to another view, notice that the sketch is actually up here. You see the purple line here, you see the purple line here, and here in 3D. The sketch has actually moved up to that plane. So it didn't simply just move the geometry, leave the sketch behind. It actually moved the sketch up to that plane, and that had the effect on the geometry. I'm going to cancel out of there. Now to change the height, it turns out it's pretty simple. All we have to do is use this little grip right here, stretch that down, and I can snap it and lock it to the reference plane up above. Doesn't really require that I name that, but I might want to name it. If I choose this and call it topside, now later, if I want, I can actually draw something else on that work surface, on the top of this conference table. For example, if there was going to be some sort of a little cutout, or there was going to be some sort of a little keystone that has a power and so forth in the middle of the conference table, what I could do is click over to an appropriate view like this floor plan, and I can go to the Home tab, and I can set the work plane. So now that I've created a named reference plane, I can choose this button, open up the list, and it may be a little difficult to see here in the 3D view beyond, but currently the floor is being highlighted. You can see it also here in the right view in blue here that the floor is being highlighted. And I can choose this, open it up, and I can choose the top side, and you'll see that blue plane jumps up above, and it's a little more clear here in the right view. You can see the blue line coincides with the top edge of the work plane there. Click OK. And now if I created a new extrusion, say right here, and I'm just going to sort of eyeball the size of this thing and click Finish. It's awfully tall. I could adjust that. The right way to adjust that, of course, would be to create a new reference plane, constrain that reference plane, and attach the top edge of that. But as you can see, you can create the work plane first and then draw the geometry, or you can draw the geometry and then say, oops, I need to put that on a certain work plane and move it to the other work plane. I will say, however, though, the before or after only works if they're parallel. So in other words, I could not take this box that I've just drawn on the top of the table, choose Edit Work Plane, and move it to the vertical work planes. Notice how there's only 3 choices here? If I cancel out of here and I go back to Home and choose the Set button, notice there's far more than the 3 choices. We also have the center front back and the center left right. And if I choose that, it actually makes the vertical work plane active. So you get more flexibility if you set the work plane first and then draw the geometry, and we'll do that in the next movie.